One of the myths of Australian history is that the overseas student program in Australia began with the Colombo Plan. In fact, Australia was a destination for overseas students from the early 20th century onwards, when the pros and cons of expanding the international student presence began to be part of the national conversation. Such conversations became more insistent in the post-war period as Asian nationalism transformed Australia's place in the world. In many ways, the Colombo Plan student program was a continuation of the sponsored student schemes developed during the 1940s. This paper will contextualise the Colombo Plan student program within the broader history of Australia's involvement with international education. It will also show how the Menzies government expanded the sponsored overseas student program via the Colombo Plan and was able to strategically capitalise on the presence of Asian students in a way that the preceding Chifley government could not or would not. At the dawn of federation, at least some non-European students were residing in Australia. They included the children of Chinese, Japanese and Indian merchants, storekeepers and farmers, along with those of Pacific Island labourers. Early Commonwealth legislation, however, reduced the number of non-Europeans gaining access to the Australian education system. Most Pacific Islanders were deported, and a dictation test for prospective non-European migrants was introduced to deter Asian migration. Temporary non-European visitors were nonetheless allowed into Australia under the category of students. The majority of students arriving in the first half of the 20th century were from Asia, but some Pacific Islanders, notably from Tonga and Nauru, gained entry, mostly studying at secondary level. The first formal policy decision on overseas students was the Watson Labor government's 1904 decision to relax regulations relating to the entry of Indian and Japanese students. The new regulations allowed Japanese and Indian visitors to enter Australia for educational purposes. They were exempt from the dictation test, but had to apply for a certificate of exemption from this test after 12 months. The 1904 regulations for Japanese and Indian students were widely publicised, but responsible ministers remained tight-lipped about the fact that from around this point onwards, they were also quietly allowing temporary entry for Chinese students as well, wanting to avoid alienating the small but assertive Australian Chinese business community, but also committed to a white Australia marked by anti-Chinese prejudices. Successive Commonwealth administrations found it difficult to develop a cohesive Chinese student policy. This is reflected in the 1912 comments of Josiah Thomas, External Affairs Minister in the Fisher Labor government, and I quote, "When I first came here to the External Affairs Department, I found that quite a number of young Chinese had been permitted to come to Australia in order to go to the schools. Most were young children from 11 to 14 years of age, and the idea was that they would remain in Australia for 3 or 4 years and then return to China. But the thing began to grow until it looked like assuming large proportions. Then I decided to shut down on it," end quote. The Fisher government subsequently introduced regulations for students in which Chinese students were only eligible to enter Australia if they were aged between 17 and 24 and could only remain in the country for 6 years. By 1920, however, the age restrictions had been removed and students could stay as long as they needed to complete their studies. As Home and Territories Minister George Pearce noted, this was recognition that there are good grounds for believing that Chinese students now being trained in Australia will play a prominent part in promoting trade between China and Australia in the future. If the government decided to discontinue altogether the concessions granted to students, such action would react detrimentally on the trade relations which businessmen in Australia are now endeavouring to build up, end quote. Such views mirrored comments made by Asian and Western observers over several decades. Commentators such as the 1930s Chinese Consulate General Dr. Pao urged Australia to reap the potential economic benefits of encouraging overseas students to enter the country. Dr. Pao said that America and England had long realised that Chinese students returning to their own countries were potential trade ambassadors. Australians, he said, should realise their best friends in the East are the Chinese who have returned from Australia. While Australia's exports to China had reached a value of £1,973,862 in 1934-35, the Commonwealth was not inclined during the interwar period to prioritise Asian student policy. It fluctuated between restricting and loosening conditions of entry based on age limits. It's unlikely that there were more than a few hundred mainland and ethnic Chinese studying in Australia in any given year during the 1920s and 30s. In any case, Australia remained economically and culturally focused on its ties with Britain, and Commonwealth politicians presumably wished to minimise suspicion that they were not taking the White Australia policy seriously. Aside from setting and enforcing immigration conditions, Australian governments had little practical engagement with non-European overseas students. However, during the interwar period, some church-based groups filled in the gaps. One such example was Miss Sears of the Presbyterian Women's Mission Union, who ran a school for Chinese nationals in Little Bourke Street, Melbourne, emphasising English language and singing. Subsequently, the University of Western Australia offered at least one scholarship for an Indian student to study agricultural economics, with the successful candidate in 1939 being selected by the Australian Christian Movement. Furthermore, with some involvement from the Sydney branch of the London Missionary Society, Scout Commissioner Harold Hurst hosted several boys from the Pacific island of Nauru in the 1930s as they learned bookkeeping and other skills at Geelong education institutions. Indeed, it was Australia's responsibility for administering Nauru on behalf of the British Phosphate Commission, which may have begun the Commonwealth's shift from regulating overseas student entry towards actively influencing the direction of the overseas student program. From 1923, the Australian administration financed the entire provision of education for Nauru people using phosphate revenue. It was in this context that Mr. Burnick of Nauru was selected by the administration to become the first Pacific Islander to attend university in Australia in 1932. Subsequently, when the Pacific War postponed the repatriation to Nauru of islanders who had studied in Geelong, Commonwealth officials became involved in their welfare. Australian policy towards overseas students before the Second World War was ad hoc and reactive. However, much of the rationale for maintaining an overseas student presence, including international goodwill, promoting potential trade benefits, and supporting the creation of elites within developing countries, was already present, although only faintly articulated. The Chifley government of 1945 to 1949 grasped the wider significance of emerging Asian nationalism and paid increasing attention to the diplomatic aspects of the international student presence. There were only about 300 non-European students in Australia by 1947, partly a reflection of overcrowding in Australian tertiary institutions as return service personnel retrained for new careers. Despite misgivings about limited tertiary facilities, the Chifley years saw the modest beginnings of Australia's active involvement in administering overseas student scholarship schemes, influenced by the British Council and the United Nations Educational Scientific and Cultural Organisation, or UNESCO, the Department of External Affairs organised two major scholarship schemes during the 1940s. These scholarships were designed to spread Australian goodwill throughout Asia. The most important scholarship scheme of this era was the Southeast Asian Fellowship Scheme, begun in 1949. In order to partially meet its commitment to UNESCO's worldwide program of post-war reconstruction assistance, the Australian government announced that it would spend £60,000 on scholarships. Under the Southeast Asian Fellowship Scheme, Australia committed itself to providing short-term training in Australian institutions for students from Southeast Asian countries. The emphasis was not so much on gaining qualifications, rather the scholarships were designed to assist with the development of skills which would be of use to national development and reconstruction. The fellowship came to an end in 1956 after training 57 students. Apart from the UNESCO-inspired fellowship scheme, the Australian government also initiated a small international scholarship scheme on its own behalf. Cabinet decided in 1948 to award 3 scholarships a year to Southeast Asian students to study in Australian universities. The total cost was to be £5,000 per annum. As the Prime Minister stated, it was considered that the provision of opportunities in Australia for the students concerned would give further practical evidence of the goodwill of the Australian people towards the peoples of the countries concerned, such as India, Pakistan and Indonesia, end quote. The Southeast Asian Fellowship and Scholarship Schemes were jointly administered. These post-war scholarship schemes were the trial run for the Commonwealth educational policies and practices now traditionally associated with the subsequent Colombo Plan program. Like the Colombo Plan, for example, the students and their fields of study were nominated by the country receiving the aid. While the Commonwealth's education officials do not appear to have been as heavily engaged in monitoring Southeast Asian scholarship holders as they later did for Colombo Plan students, they nevertheless provided support. Commonwealth Office of Education officers assisted scholars by meeting them on their arrival, arranging accommodation, helping them settle in, and making themselves available should the student require further advice. The Australian government was also quick to respond to the demands of scholars to learn more about Australia to help them adjust to their new environment. In February 1950, all 20 UNESCO-related scholarship holders attended a summer school at Sydney University in which they learned about Australia's rural background and Australia's concepts of standards of living and social services through lectures, discussions, films, and visits to museums and other institutions. This intensive approach to learning about Australian culture was adopted in a modified format for arriving Colombo Plan students during the 1950s and 60s. In the 1940s, however, Asian irritation with the device of using scholarships as a diplomatic gesture while firmly keeping the immigration door shut overshadowed publicity given to Australian educational aid. The Chifley government's attempts to portray itself as a friend to Asia was frustrated by Immigration Minister Arthur Caldwell, who interpreted the White Australia policy with all the finesse of a buffalo in a china shop. During 1948, for example, 14 Malays and Indonesians were deported from Australia after living in the country since World War II and in some cases marrying Australian citizens. Such incidents provoked a rush of negative publicity in Singapore, Malaya and Thailand. Many Australian newspapers also embarrassed the Chifley government by providing a human face to Asian individuals facing deportation, such as Queensland farmer Frank Zhang, whose white farming colleagues lobbied the federal government and opposition to allow him to stay. Country Party leader Arthur Fadden neatly highlighted the ineffectiveness of the Southeast Asian Scholarship Scheme as a means of expressing Australian regional commitment, and I quote, "As these coloured scholarship holders will be forever debarred from re-entering Australia by the operation of the White Australia policy, the goodwill of this gesture will be completely nullified, end quote. Nevertheless, when the Menzies government came into power, it retained its commitment to sponsoring overseas students, especially via the Colombo Plan. The Colombo Plan was an aid program initiated by the British Commonwealth in 1951 to assist with the economic development of member nations in Asia. It also involved non-Commonwealth countries such as the US and Indonesia. Aid was given through a process of bilateral agreements between the donor and recipient. In contrast to the Chifley era, the Menzies administration was better able to project itself as an educational donor of goodwill. The new government symbolically overturned a number of Caldwell's notorious decisions on the deportation of Asian immigrants such as Frank Zhang, winning the Liberal administration some kudos in the Asian region. The incoming Liberal regime was hardly enlightened in relation to racial matters, but perhaps its newness as a political force meant that it was not so associated with the 1940s immigration scandals and could therefore achieve more through international education policy under the Colombo Plan. Between 1951 and 1965, Australia spent over £58.5 million on the Colombo Plan, including over £17 million on technical assistance such as scholarships. 5,908 students were accepted to study in Australia under the scheme during this time, thanks partly to the publicity devoted to it by both the Australian government and the press. The student program was the component of the Colombo Plan which received the most public attention. Numerous former Colombo Plan students subsequently obtained government leadership positions, but it's hard to qualify the influence their time in Australia had on the regional outlook of Asian leadership groups. It can be argued, however, that the Colombo Plan was one means by which the perception of Australia as a British outpost near Asia became seriously challenged. For instance, the experience of studying in Australia under the Colombo Plan helped make Australia seem less racist in the eyes of Asians. Walter Crocker, Official Secretary of the Australian High Commission in India, told External Affairs Minister Richard Casey that part of the value of the Colombo Plan was that students arrived with negative expectations regarding racial prejudice in Australia, but were powerfully and pleasantly surprised at Australian hospitality. The rapid growth in private Asian students studying in Australia during the 1950s and 60s may also have been partly inspired by positive Colombo Plan publicity. Further, despite complaints regarding the reputed anti-Asian prejudices of landladies and others, by 1954 there was a growing domestic acceptance of the Colombo Plan as an example of Australian generosity of spirit towards the Asian region. This was exemplified in a letter to the Age by Mrs. M. Swinburne, who wrote, "It has been our privilege to give part board to 3 Asians who are here studying under the Colombo Plan. We find that to know these students better is to regret that we are debarred by our own immigration law of having any chance of having them as our real next-door neighbours," end quote. The experience of hosting temporary Asian visitors helped Australians make the transition from White Australia principles to a broader acceptance of multiculturalism as racialist immigration policies were dismantled from 1966 onwards. In 1954, there was still a long way to go down this path. The Menzies government remained supportive of the White Australia policy, which Harold Holt praised as having played an important part in the building up of the Australian nation. Furthermore, a report of a 1954 official ceremony farewelling one group of Indonesian Colombo Plan students and welcoming a new group highlighted the limitations of Australia's engagement with Asia in a way that still resonates today. 2 of the visitors, in perfect English, acknowledged their recognition in speeches well above the average standard of those commonly heard in the adjacent House of Representatives, and everyone spoke sufficient English to make his way quite comfortably in Australia. By contrast, not a single Australian present was able to speak to the guests in their own tongue, although the majority were associated with the workings of the Colombo Plan. End quote. The Colombo Plan student program was one of the remarkable success stories of the Menzies years. It contributed to the economic development of emerging Asian nations and remains a potent symbol of Australia's shift towards regional engagement with Asia during the latter half of the 20th century. But it did not emerge from a vacuum. Australia had an overseas student program from the first decade of the 20th century, and the ideas of international goodwill and developing trade links through hosting international students were being discussed by commentators at an early stage in the nation's history. However, it was only the rise of Asian nationalism after World War II that forced the Commonwealth to commit more seriously to regional engagement, and one of those ways was through sponsoring overseas students. The Chifley's modest scholarship schemes set up the policy framework which was later used for managing Colombo Plan students arriving in Australia. However, Labor's goodwill message through the scholarship scheme was drowned out by negative publicity surrounding post-war deportations. By contrast, the Menzies government was more discreet in its continued support for a wide Australia policy, and by rapidly expanding the sponsored overseas student program in the 1950s and 60s, it gained positive publicity both at home and abroad. Thank you.
Questions for Lyndon? Yes, over there.
Yes, with the Colombo Plan, most of the students coming to Australia came on scholarships. Today, that is no longer the case, as I think we all know that most international students basically pay full fees. They are Australia's third or fourth largest export industry, Victoria's first export industry, as I understand it. So could you sort of fill in what has happened since the Colombo Plan with a lot of scholarships and now international students being a source of revenue for Australian universities?
Well, they've always been a source of revenue, and in fact, fee-paying overseas students have always been much higher in terms of statistics than sponsored students. It was, in fact, in the 1950s and 60s, they dwarfed the Colombo Plan by a very large degree, and other smaller programs for PNG students, Maroon students, and African students. However, by 1966, you've got the Gorton government, Gorton as Department of Education and Science Minister, becoming concerned that, in fact, at that stage, you've got fee-paying Australian students, and there is a certain subsidy within the tertiary program, so they're not paying the full fee so much. Gordon becomes worried about the sort of the hidden subsidy of fee-paying overseas students at that time. So we're looking at gradually by 1966 about 11,000, a peak of 11,000 fee-paying overseas students. The situation changes, particularly in the from 1979 with different policy settings, but certainly by the 1980s and 90s, the much more expensive full fee-paying program develops. So in some ways, it's a slightly different kettle of fish from the fee-paying overseas students of the past.
Are you able to give us any news about what became or what was called the new Colombo Plan, where instead of bringing Asian students here, it must have been 5 years ago that the government established the new Colombo Plan and proceeded to send emerging leaders to Asian schools. Can you give us any update on the extent to which that's been a success or otherwise?
The short answer is no, but does anyone in the room have more up-to-date advice on the new Colombo plan? I'm pretty sure it's still...
What about thank you. Your paper is very good, but I didn't know in the late 19th, early 20th, China government sent the student, to Australia. I only know they got the project, sent the student to America, but I don't know they are also have a project sent to Australia. So thank you. And the other thing is, I just did research about the international student with the Colombo plan. I believe we not only look after the student to study, also look after their life. I knew Melbourne Uni is the first university academic the overseas student. Menzies opened the international college. Yeah.